I never expected that moving in with my new husband David and his son Michael would turn into something far more complicated than blending our lives together. Marrying David was one of the best decisions I'd made, but it came with unexpected changes. Michael had just turned 21, and after finishing school, was trying to figure out his next steps in life. With David off on business trips, I was left spending a lot of time alone with my stepson. Things had been comfortable between us, almost too comfortable. We got along great, and it was easy to be around him. Michael was thoughtful, mature beyond his years, and there was never any real tension. At first, I chalked this up to him simply being kind and considerate. But as time went on, there were moments, small ones, that made me question if there was something more, if there was something neither of us was willing to admit. It all came to a head one morning when I was alone in the house, preparing for a quiet day while David was away on a work trip. I was in the bathroom, finishing up my morning routine. The sound of the shower still lingered in the air, and steam curled along the mirrors. I had been deep in thought, replaying the conversation I'd had with Michael the night before. It had been innocent enough, about his future, his plans, but there was a look in his eyes, a hesitation that I couldn't quite shake. That morning, as I stood at the bathroom sink drying my hair, I heard a knock on the bathroom door. Michael's voice came through the door, low but gentle. "You in there?" I blinked, surprised. Michael didn't usually knock on the bathroom door, especially this early in the morning. I glanced at my reflection, then turned toward the door. "Yeah, Michael, I'm here. What's up?" There was a brief pause, and I heard him shift on the other side. "Sorry to bother you, but I need to grab something from the bathroom. Do you mind if I come in for a moment?" I hesitated. The steam still clung to the air, and I was wrapped in a thin towel, my hair damp from the shower. But Michael's voice sounded innocent enough, and it wasn't unusual for him to need something quickly. "Sure," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Come on in." The door opened slowly, and Michael stepped inside. He was dressed in sweats, his hair messy as if he'd just woken up. He glanced at me, then quickly turned toward the cabinet, rummaging through it as he searched for whatever it was he needed. I turned back to the mirror, pretending to focus on drying my hair. But I couldn't help but feel the shift in the air between us. It was subtle, but undeniable. The way he moved through the space, the way his eyes lingered on me for just a moment longer than usual before he looked away. It was enough to make my pulse quicken. After a moment, I heard him stop rummaging. "Got it," he said quietly, holding up a bottle of aspirin. But instead of leaving, he lingered, his gaze flicking back to me. "You, getting ready for something?" "No, just starting my day," I replied, glancing over at him, trying to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Why?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter, the tension in the room growing with each passing second. "I don't know. You look different." The comment caught me off guard. Different. I turned to face him fully, towel still wrapped around me, and met his gaze. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, an intensity, a curiosity, that made my breath catch. "Different how?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Michael swallowed, glancing away for a moment before looking back at me. "I don't know. It's hard to explain." I stood there, unsure of what to say. The silence between us grew heavier. The air felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension that I didn't know how to navigate. This was Michael, my stepson. I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't be standing here, caught between wanting to ignore the moment and acknowledging what was happening. Before I could say anything, Michael stepped closer, closing the distance between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him, unsure of what he was going to do. He stopped just a few feet away from me, his eyes locked on mine. "I'm sorry if this is weird," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But I've been feeling something lately, and I don't know if it's just me." My breath hitched. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I had felt it too. That subtle shift in our relationship, the way we seemed to be growing closer in ways that weren't just familial. "Michael," I started, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what this is, but before I could finish, he stepped even closer, his hand gently brushing against my arm. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. It was even exciting, leaving me breathless. I looked up at him, my heart racing, and in that moment, I knew we had crossed a line, one that neither of us had expected, but one that had been building for some time. "I know this is wrong," Michael whispered, his hand lingering on my arm, "but I can't help how I feel." I couldn't speak. The weight of the moment was overwhelming, and all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't process. This was my stepson, David's son, but the connection between us, the pull I felt toward him, was undeniable. I need to go," I said suddenly, stepping back, breaking the contact between us. My voice was shaky, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. Michael nodded, his expression pained. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I interrupted, trying to steady myself. "We'll talk later." Without waiting for a response, I slipped past him and hurried out of the bathroom, my mind a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and something else I wasn't ready to admit. As I closed the door to my bedroom behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? I knew nothing tangible had happened. Not yet. But I was in a full blur, uncertain of what to do next. I spent the rest of that day trying to pretend that nothing had happened. I busied myself with household chores, ran errands, anything to keep my mind off the encounter in the bathroom. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the memory of Michael standing so close to me, the way his touch had made me feel, or the look in his eyes that I had never seen before. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I had married David and Michael. It was supposed to be simple. Family. Nothing more. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated, and by the time I realized, it was already too late to turn back. Alone in the house for the afternoon, David was off on yet another of his endless business trips, and Michael had stepped out shortly after, leaving me with nothing but my racing thoughts. The stillness of the house pressed in on me, almost suffocating, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable reality of what had just transpired. I kept replaying that moment over and over, trying to make sense of it all. The way he had looked at me, his words lingering in the air, my heart pounding faster than I ever expected. I felt that undeniable pull, the one that hadn't been there before. It wasn't supposed to be like this. By evening, the tension in my chest had grown unbearable. Michael had been absent all day, And while a part of me was relieved, because I had no idea how to face him again after everything, I couldn't shake the part of me that missed him. I wondered where he was, what he was thinking, and if he too was battling the same confusion I was. When I heard the front door open, my heart leaped into my throat. It was him. My pulse quickened, and before I knew it, I had set down the glass of wine I hadn't even realized I was holding. The door creaked as Michael entered, his expression unreadable, as if he too was unsure how to navigate this newfound tension between us. We locked eyes for a moment. It was silent, heavy. And then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, as if testing the waters. "Hey," he said. I felt the tremble in my own voice as I replied, "Hey." I stood up, suddenly self-conscious. "I wasn't sure if you'd be back tonight." "I needed some air," he answered, eyes darting to the window. There was an unease in his gaze that mirrored mine. He was nervous, uncertain. A part of me longed to fill the silence, to say the right thing that would put everything back to normal. But nothing came. Instead, my mind went back to the way he looked, the way his shirt clung to his chest, the way his hair fell into his eyes. He wasn't the boy I had married into this family with. He had grown, and standing here now, in the quiet of the room, it was impossible to ignore how much he had changed. He stepped closer, hands buried in his pockets, his eyes locked on the floor. "About earlier, I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know what came over me." I shook my head, taking a slow breath, even though my heart was racing. "It's okay," I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing. "I wasn't expecting any of that." He nodded, his eyes lifting to meet mine. "I just feel like something's between us. I know it's wrong. I get it. But I can't deny it." His words were like a punch to the gut, and I struggled to catch my breath. I wanted to stop him, to say something that would end this before it spiraled further. But the truth was, I couldn't deny it either. There was something undeniable, something that had been growing beneath the surface for a long time, something I had been too scared to acknowledge. "Michael," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We can't. This can't happen. You're David's son, and I know." He cut me off, his voice pained, raw. "I know all of that, but it doesn't change how I feel." The space between us was shrinking with every second. I wanted to step back, to distance myself, but my feet were frozen in place. And then, to my surprise, I didn't pull away. Instead, I reached out and took his hand. The moment our skin met, it was electric. A jolt ran through me, a rush of heat that I couldn't ignore. I looked up, my breath caught in my throat, and saw the same mixture of emotions swirling in his eyes: confusion, guilt, desire, and something deeper, something I couldn't name. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Michael whispered, his thumb brushing over my hand, sending shivers down my spine. "But I can't pretend this isn't real." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of truth. I knew he was right. There was something between us, something real, something that felt impossible to ignore, even though it was wrong on every level. I should have walked away, should have resisted. But standing there with him, the warmth of his hand sending my heart into overdrive, I realized I didn't have the strength to pull away. Not now. not when it felt so powerful, so undeniable. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, barely able to breathe. He moved closer, his hand tightening around mine. "We don't have to figure it out right now," he said softly, almost reassuringly. "But we can't keep pretending nothing's happening." The words hung between us, and in that moment, I knew he was right. We couldn't pretend anymore. The tension that had been building was out in the open, and there was no going back. Before I could say anything more, Michael leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hand finding its way to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss was everything I had been holding back. Desire, confusion, guilt, and something more, something deeper. It was raw. It was real. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths were heavy, our foreheads resting against each other. The weight of what we had just done settled over us, and for a fleeting moment, I expected regret. But instead, there was relief. Relief that the tension had finally been broken. Relief that we had stopped pretending. Michael looked down at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly, his voice uncertain. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that things had changed between us. There was no going back to the way things had been before. But standing there, holding his hand, I realized I didn't want to go back. "This isn't over," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "But we'll figure it out." He smiled, and for the first time since that morning, I felt a sense of calm. Whatever this was, whatever it would become, we would face it together. And the story was far from over. As the warmth of the day's fading light lingered in the air, we found ourselves slipping into a comfortable routine, spending quiet evenings together, talking about nothing and everything. It was the kind of silence that only comes when two people are deeply in tune with each other, when mere presence speaks louder than words. Michael was close, our knees brushing lightly, his skin radiating warmth that sent a familiar shiver down my spine. I could feel his gaze on me, and when I turned to meet his eyes, a soft, almost uncertain smile spread across his face, one that sent my heart into a frenzy. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low, almost tentative. There was a slight hesitation, a vulnerability in the way he spoke. I nodded, shifting slightly to face him, sensing that something important was coming. He looked down at his hands, clearly gathering his thoughts before speaking again. "Have you thought about what this means? I mean, for us?" His question hung in the air, heavy with implications. I swallowed hard, feeling the sudden pressure in my chest. I had thought about it constantly, but the fear of voicing those thoughts, of confronting what was growing between us, made it almost impossible to put it into words. "I have," I whispered, my voice softer than I intended. "But I don't know if I have any answers." He nodded, still looking down, but his fingers clenched around his palms as if he were searching for strength. I don't want you to think this is just some passing phase or something," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity. "I care about you more than I probably should, and I know this is complicated, but I can't stop how I feel." His words hung in the air like a thick fog, an unspoken confession, raw and powerful. It was the truth. one I could feel in every beat of my own heart. I cared about him too, more than I should have. The reality of it, the messiness of our emotions, pressed heavily on my chest. I was terrified of the consequences, terrified of what it meant for us, for my marriage to David. I care about you too, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But this isn't just about us. There's David. He's your father, and my husband. My words were a bitter pill, one that stuck in my throat as I said them. The reality of the situation was becoming undeniable, and the weight of it almost crushed me. If David found out... Michael's expression tightened, his jaw clenched, but he didn't look away from me. I know, he said quietly. I don't want to hurt him either, but I also can't keep pretending like nothing's happening between us. I bit my lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. What we had was undeniable, and yet the consequences of it felt like an impending storm. I don't know what the right thing is, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. But I can't ignore this anymore. His gaze softened as he reached out, taking my hand gently in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment, everything else faded away. We'll figure it out, he said softly, his thumb brushing the back of my hand as if making a promise. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. The certainty in his words gave me a fleeting sense of peace, even though deep inside I knew things were far from simple. We didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a while, I felt like it didn't matter. What mattered was the connection between us, the undeniable bond we shared. The world outside faded as we sat in silence, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the yard, and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets. I leaned my head against his shoulder, the rhythm of his breathing a comforting lullaby. In that moment, I felt an unexpected calm. But even in that peace, a thought lingered. The reality of what was coming. David would be home soon, and I would have to face him. How could I pretend everything was normal when everything felt so wrong? For the next few days, Michael and I kept things casual. We tried not to dwell on the future, but it was impossible to ignore. The pull between us was undeniable, but the guilt, the fear, weighed on me heavily. I couldn't shake the thoughts that spiraled in my mind. One night, just before David was set to return, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the house eerily quiet. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, but it did nothing to quiet my thoughts. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to Michael, to the way his touch had set my skin on fire, to the way his kiss had made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between my feelings for Michael and my loyalty to David. But the idea of making that choice, of losing either of them, was too painful to even consider. As I lay there, lost in the chaos of my mind, I heard a soft knock at the bedroom door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up, pulse racing. Anne? Michael's voice was quiet, steady. Can I come in? Come in, I whispered, my voice trembling. The door opened slowly and Michael stepped inside, his expression serious. He closed the door behind him and walked over to the bed, sitting down beside me. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavily in the space between us. I've been thinking, he said softly, his eyes fixed on the floor. About what you said. About David. I know this is hard. I don't want to put you in a position where you have to choose. His words broke through the silence, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. Michael, I whispered, I love you. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and the impact of them hit me like a punch to the chest. His eyes widened with surprise, and then with hope. You do? I nodded, my heart pounding. I do, but that doesn't make this any easier. There was a pause, a brief moment of silence, and I could see he didn't know what to say next. And then, suddenly, I knew what I had to do. I reached out, pulling back the sheets, silently asking him to join me. It was a decision born of emotion, not reason, but in that moment, I didn't care. He understood immediately, joining me on the bed. As we kissed, as the connection between us deepened, I felt a wave of relief. It was as if, in that moment, I had finally chosen. But as quickly as it started, it ended. The excitement, the intensity, all of it faded. Yet, in that silence, I understood. It wasn't just about the moment. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. Michael reached for my hand, and we sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on us. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice steady with quiet resolve. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. And in that moment, I believed him. It felt like the calm before a storm, the weight of everything unresolved between Michael and me hanging in the air like a thick fog we couldn't escape. I knew things were about to change with David back, but none of us knew how. What we had been skirting around for so long, that delicate tension, was no longer just a passing thing. It had transformed into something far more complicated, something that neither of us knew how to navigate. Every attempt to push it aside was futile. The truth was inescapable. It was a matter of time. David's return was marked by his usual charm, a hug, a kiss, and the typical chatter of catching up. But as he filled the room with his usual energy, I couldn't shake the oppressive silence that Michael and I shared. It was like everything was normal on the surface, yet under that mask, I felt like I was suffocating. The subtle glances Michael and I exchanged spoke volumes, but there was no room for words. Not with David there. After dinner, David suggested we all gather in the living room to talk, to unwind after the day. I sat, forcing a smile, but my heart was anything but calm. Michael sat across from me, his eyes briefly meeting mine before looking away. The distance between us was palpable, despite the ordinary conversation that David tried to keep going. But nothing could distract me from the crushing weight of unspoken words. Eventually, David stepped away for a work call, and we were left alone. The silence was deafening. Michael shifted in his seat, his body tense, and I could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict of wanting to say something but not knowing how. I knew it was time, but I couldn't keep going like this. Not in the shadows, not with everything we had yet to resolve. We can't keep doing this behind David's back, I finally said, my voice heavy with guilt. It's not fair to him. Michael's face hardened as he stood and turned toward me. What are you saying? He asked, his voice betraying his fear. I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment we both knew was coming but had tried to avoid. We need to figure this out, I whispered, barely above a breath. We can't keep living in this limbo. He stared at me, his pain palpable, and then he spoke softly. You're right, but what does that mean for us? I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to answer. But deep down, I knew this could not continue. The longer we waited, the worse it would get, and I feared the fallout. But it had to be addressed. Now or later. There was no avoiding it. I don't know, I replied honestly, feeling the weight of my words. But we can't keep pretending. He nodded slowly, his sadness mirroring my own. He moved closer, sitting beside me on the couch. His hand found mine, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. It was just the two of us. But even then, the weight of what we'd done and what lay ahead pressed on us both. I wish things were different, he whispered. So do I whispered back. But we can't pretend forever. The sound of David's voice drifted in from the other room, but for us, it felt like the last few moments of peace before the inevitable storm. The next morning, after David left for work, I found myself standing in the kitchen with Michael. We were standing on the edge of something, but neither of us had the courage to take the first step. Finally, the silence was broken. I think we need to talk, I said quietly, my voice shaking. Michael nodded, his face unreadable. Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. We sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of what we were about to say looming over us. I tried to speak, but the words seemed so inadequate for what I was feeling. I love David, I began, but I can't ignore what's been happening between us. I care about you, Michael, more than I should. And I don't know how to make sense of that when I'm married to your father. Michael leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. I don't want to hurt him, but I don't want to lose you either. His words cut through me like a knife, and for the first time, I couldn't hold back the tears that had been building. We were standing at a crossroads, and no matter how much I wanted things to stay the same, I knew it wasn't possible. I think we need to take a step back, I said, my voice trembling. We need to figure out what this is without rushing into anything, and maybe that means we need some space. For now. Michael's face fell, the pain in his expression undeniable. Step back? He repeated, his voice breaking. I think it's the only way, I whispered, my heart aching for him. We can't keep doing this and expect it to work. We need time to figure it out. He sat there motionless, the internal conflict written all over his face. After a long pause, he nodded. Okay, if that's what you think is best. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. I don't want to lose you either, Michael, but we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other. I don't want to lose you either, he whispered, his voice full of a sadness I couldn't bear. But if this is what we need to do, then I'll do it. The conversation left me exhausted, drained, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. We had finally faced the truth. No more pretending. It was going to be hard, but it was the only way forward. In the following days, Michael and I kept our distance, giving ourselves the space to figure things out. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that no matter what happened, we would face it together. Slowly, we would find our way, one day at a time. But the bond between us was undeniable. Even if it changed, it would remain. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The house was quiet, David's absence echoing through the rooms. But in that stillness, I felt peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for now, that was enough.